Hello guys and welcome to episode 39 of the Beat Your Backlog podcast, a podcast discussing the things gamers like to put off, get to another day, and oh yes, will definitely beat later, their backlog. I'm your host Adam, and today I am holidaying in the beautiful Austrian Alps in Microbird Games' and Curve Games' Dungeons of Hinterberg. The game seems to be Microbird's first game, and they are an indie studio based in Vienna, Austria, and seem to be quite a small studio with only 2 to 10 employees. And the reason I'm telling you this is because I also live in Vienna, Austria, so that kind of link there between them and them being from Vienna and me living in Austria obviously is a reason why I played this game. Dungeons of Hinterberg released on July 18th on Xbox Game Pass, so obviously Xbox X and S, Steam, and is currently sitting at an 81 and 82 on the Xbox and PC respectively. The game has been getting some pretty good reviews, and in one of its most glowing reviews from the wisest tavernas of Kotaku, he states 10 out of 10 would slay again. Its top-notch dungeon design only further complements an absolute joy it was to sink into its world filled with magic. Like the best vacation spots, I can't wait to be drawn in by Hinterberg's magnetism again and revel in its luxuries for a long time. Which I was quite surprised to read from Kotaku, because we've talked about some of their reviews previously on the podcast, and I don't always agree with them. But I think this is a really generous review, and is one that I actually almost completely agree with from Kotaku, because I absolutely loved playing Dungeons of Hinterberg. But what is it that makes this game so good? Well, let's find out on this week's episode of the Beat Your Backlog podcast. But before we start, I would like to ask you, and please remind you, that if you're enjoying the podcast so far, or you've listened to the podcast previously, please leave us a 5-star review on Spotify or wherever you're listening. And also don't forget to follow us there so you get the notification when a new episode goes live. And now let's get on with the show. So the game opens up with the main protagonist, Louisa Dorfer, sitting in a taxi on her way to a much needed holiday. Louisa is a junior lawyer in desperate need of hitting the reset button from her busy and stressful life in Vienna, and I kind of know how that feels. She has decided to visit Hinterberg, a small village in the Austrian Alps, which was formerly a famous spa and skiing resort for the old Austrian nobility. However, about 3 years ago, the small picturesque village was shot onto the world stage because of the appearance of magic in its surrounding areas. The magic created 25 dungeons around the village, which drew in world-famous slayers, who attempt to solve the dungeon's puzzles and slay the very Austrian folklore-themed monsters that dwell within them. Since then, Hinterberg has become a top tourist location in Europe, with visitors drawn in by the prospect of using magic and gaining glory in the dungeons. Louisa arrives at Hinterberg unsure of herself and if slaying is actually for her, but after getting her first taste of magic and getting to know the weird and wonderful locals, Louisa decides to stay. Jump forward a bit in time, and without too many spoilers, Louisa and her friends discover that not everything is as light-hearted and cheerful in Hinterberg as it seems, so Louisa vows, with the help of her friends, to beat all 25 dungeons of Hinterberg and restore the town to its more peaceful state. And I actually was really surprised by the story in Dungeons of Hinterberg, because when I kind of first started the game, I just kind of thought like, it's kind of funny, like kind of a fantasy twist on like a real world location, because I kind of thought it was just going to be a bit kind of throwaway the story, and it's just like used as a reason to explain why there are dungeons in like a small Austrian alpine town. However, as you kind of progress through the plot, it really does start to thicken and ask a lot of real world issues surrounding mass tourism that troubles a lot of small communities in European towns. And like, for example, it asks the question is the wealth earned by the tourism in the town worth the town losing its soul and its character? And I thought this was quite interesting because, like I said, I live in Austria, and I kind of believe that Hinterberg is loosely based on an Austrian town called Hallstatt. And Hallstatt is like one of these towns that it's used a lot in marketing to like Asian tourists or Middle Eastern tourists. Sort of this is what an alpine Austrian town looks like, even though I don't think it's technically in the Alps. But like Hinterberg, it's a beautiful town, very old fashioned, very colourful, with the houses kind of in different shades of like yellow and pink and blue. It's also on a really beautiful lake that has like crystal clear water, surrounded by mountains, and it also has like this very iconic church that sits right on the lakefront with this very tall spire. And yeah, if you look at pictures of Hallstatt and you look at pictures of Hinterberg, to me they look very similar. And I actually visited Hallstatt about 6 years ago. And to be honest, the town itself there's not really much to do there for a tourist other than, you know, look around the idyllic town, go and eat there, get an ice cream. There is like it's like an old salt mine that you can visit and kind of get a tour through the old caves and mine shafts there. But that's about it. It's not like there's a huge, I don't know, like a huge theme park or anything like that. It's just a really beautiful town. And that kind of means that because it's not really a tourist town, or I mean it is, but there isn't really much there for tourism, it means that the town is still mostly inhabited by locals. So many of the questions posed in the Dungeons of Hinterberg are posed in this town too. And I remember at the time when I was there, I mean, I was a tourist as well, obviously, but the town was packed full of people with tour buses just kind of like jostling to try and get places to park and to drop off the tourists. And I think I read an article by the BBC that the town has 10,000 day trippers a day in summer. So it just kind of shows you the scale of how many people are visiting the town versus, I don't know, the town probably has like a maximum, probably like 1,000 inhabitants. So you can just see how this town has become overwhelmed by tourists. And I remember also being there, like the one thing that stuck with me other than how beautiful the town is, was that all over the town there were big red signs written in multiple languages asking people not to fly drones and also asking them not to take photos through windows, because obviously people live in the town. And it kind of also reminded me of another place that is struggling with mass tourism, which is Venice. And I also visited Venice recently, so I'm part of the problem. But I remember talking to a tour guide there, and he was saying that a lot of tourists come here thinking it's a theme park, that it's been built just for people to visit. They don't realize that it's an actual city and has like a huge, you know, almost like a millennia long history, and that regular people still do live in the town. And I think, yeah, that was kind of the same with Hinterberg, with people flying their drones and taking pictures through the windows of the houses because they think, oh, this is like a model village and this isn't real. But for the people living there, it's obviously a nightmare. And that's kind of, yeah, that's, again, the questions that I think Hinterberg's story gets to, is that the regular people have to live with the consequences of mass tourism. And you know, in Venice, in the real world, the consequence seems to be that there isn't enough housing for the locals, or at least enough that they can afford, because the apartments have all been turned into Airbnbs. And it seems in Hallstatt and in Hinterberg, it's that the locals in these small communities are having to live their lives around waves of tourism. And that's exactly what Dungeons of Hinterberg story kind of does very well. It asks the question, at what cost are the locals of Hinterberg willing to sacrifice the local people for profit? So yeah, we get on to a little bit about, so we've talked a little bit about the story, but what is the actual game about? Well, I'm glad you asked, because I think you can split the game into two major segments. The first is the dungeons and the combat, and the second is the social/relationship management of the people of Hinterberg. And a lot of people are kind of saying that this game is like a mix of Zelda and the Persona games, that you have the Zelda sort of dungeon crawling and puzzles, and then you also have the Persona like relationship management. But anyway, getting onto it, as I stated before, there are 25 dungeons in Hinterberg, which you have to finish to beat the game. The dungeons are split up between 4 areas around Hinterberg. So there is kind of like a foot of the mountain area called Doberkugel. There is an autumnal forest called Hinterwald. There is the snowy peaks of Kolmstein and the dreary but pretty bog, I should say, of Brunnosumpf. Each of these areas are like kind of semi-open world areas which you can explore, kind of find the puzzle, the dungeon portals. You can find chests. There are these relaxation spots where you can spend the afternoon there and relax instead of taking on a dungeon, which gives you kind of a buff. And there are lots of other secrets on the map, and you can kind of, you can kind of wander them at your leisure. Each dungeon has a difficulty level, which is based on Louisa's attack and defense stat, which is usually, I think, is between 1 and 9. And depending on what type of experience you're looking for in the game, you can, if you can find the dungeons in the open world areas, you can try and attempt the dungeons with a higher level of yours. But for me, I was kind of like, yeah, I just want to kind of enjoy the game. I don't need too much challenge, so I just attempted the dungeons that had the same stat as I had. And I think the game does a really good job of distributing the dungeons throughout its 4 different areas, because it's not just that, like, you know, you have like the easy dungeons in area 1, and then like medium level dungeons in area 2, and then hard levels at area 3. It sort of like distributes them all over. So for example, you start the game in Doberkugel, but you can see on the map that there is a level 7 dungeon there, even though you might only be level 2. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of like Metroidvania games, where you can see it and maybe you leave a mental note of like, okay, there is a harder level here that I know I'm going to come back to, but for now I'll just focus on the dungeons that are my level. So I kind of really like that it wasn't like the early part of the game you were just in one area and then you never ever saw that area again. It kind of, you were going backwards and forwards between the 4 areas throughout the game. And as you went, like new areas opened up, so you could find the harder dungeons and more secrets and everything. So I really like that kind of world design that they had there. And each area surrounding Hinterberg also has its very own unique version of magic that can only be used in that area to solve its puzzles in the dungeon there. So again, so the first area that you get to is Doberkugel, and you have a giant metal ball there, which you can use to throw at rocks, and explode it to blow up the rocks. And you also get like a spiked metal ball on a chain, which you can use to throw at like these. There are like these jelly blocks that play a big part in a lot of the puzzles there. And you can use it to throw it at them and then pull on them, and they work like a switch basically, so you switch them on and off. In Hinterwald, there's a tornado that you can use to lift yourself above deadly thorns or up onto otherwise inaccessible ledges. And there's also there an air attack, which you can use to suck in. There are like these flower buds that are explosive. You can use your attack to sort of suck them into you, and then you can throw it at it's kind of like these like eyes, like there's like this goo with an eye, and you throw it at that and it explodes, and then the goo disappears. But my favorite magic ability of the game is the hoverboard ability, or I should say one of my favorite, not my actual favorite, but one of them is in Kornstein. So Kornstein is like I said, it's like a mountain peak with lots of snow, and you get a hoverboard, which is more or less you can use as like a snowboard, and you get to kind of downhill snowboard a little bit, and then you can also use it to grind on like these magical rails that connects all of these different areas together. And then the other ability is like a laser that you can use to cut down, if there's like a big icicle hanging from the roof, you can use it to cut down the icicles that you can then use as like stepping stones to get across gaps. And finally, my actual favorite abilities were in Brunelsumpf, where you have like a slime cube that you can kind of spawn from the ground. And what was cool was you can use it obviously to get up to different ledges, but in combat you can use it to kind of stick enemies in place, which was really cool. And you also got this ball of electricity, which you kind of spawned, and it would move slowly in a direction, and then you could then pause it in one space. So again, it was like a really great combo in combat to spawn the slime block, and then spawn the shock ball, and have the shock ball just stay on the slime block and just zap the enemies there, which was really cool. And yeah, all of your magical abilities are bound to RB if you're playing on Xbox like I did, and that's for the main one. So like for the hoverboard, the slime block, the tornado, and the exploding ball, and the other ones are all on LB. No, I think I mixed that up. I think LB is the regular one, so the ball, the tornado, the block, and the hoverboard, and the projectile ones are on RB. And yeah, and it's kind of cool because, like I said, you can only use these magical abilities in the areas that you find them. So it's kind of cool that how all of the dungeons are designed just around those abilities. And in general, I thought the dungeons in this game were really, really amazing. Like I said, it's very cool how unique each one felt when you entered it. Even though they all have the same foundations based on the magical abilities you have. I also like that a lot of the dungeons kind of have nods to other games in them. So for one example, and a slight spoiler, but there is a dungeon called Glacial Galaxy, and it's obviously inspired by Super Mario Galaxy. And I think it's just so cool how they pull it off, because you have all of like there are like the mini planets like you get in Mario, where Mario can kind of run all the way around them and the camera kind of tracks to where you are. And then yeah, you get on your hoverboard and grind on the rail to the next planet. Again, very similar to Super Mario Galaxy, which was awesome. And there was a few other ones, like there was another one where you're on like a raft and it's moving along a river. And there's lots of games that do this, obviously, but then enemies spawn on the raft and you have to fight them off. But what was cool was the camera angle goes from kind of behind you as like third person to isometric. So it kind of really reminded me of Hades. There's a section in Hades in I can't remember what the level's called, but it's the one with all of the lava, where you get on the boat and then or you get on a raft and it moves and you have to defeat all of the enemies or stay alive long enough until the wrath stops. So that was another nod. Also, yeah, the game does a lot of cool things with the camera. Like they do that where it goes out to like isometrical. There are other ones where it turns into almost like a 2D platformer, like very kind of almost like Metroidy in some ways. And then there's another one where the game really zooms out, so you can see most of the entire dungeon all at once, and it kind of, there are levels where you have to move the dungeon around almost like a Rubik's cube, which is really cool as well. So the puzzles in the dungeons are really, really well designed and really well unique, and very, very unique, I should say. And I love, yeah, that there are kind of nods to other games in them. And yeah, I actually thought like they was really well designed for me in the sense of I thought they were challenging, but they weren't frustrating. So a lot of them had me kind of scratching my head, and you kind of like looking at them and you think, okay, everything I need obviously is in this area to solve the puzzle. I just have to work out what to do. And then it would kind of like click for me where you're like, okay, I get it. I need to do this and change this lever and move this thing around, and then I get it. And then you would get to like move on to the next section, and you kind of like leave feeling like, I'm an absolute genius, because it's not just like so easy that you walk in, see, okay, there's a switch there and I need to throw this at the switch and the door opens. It is a little bit more sort of not complicated, but a bit more like well designed of that, where there are like usually like 2 or 3 things that you have to work out how it works together. And you only have like really 2 options to solve the puzzles because of the 2 magical abilities you have. So you have to just kind of work it out. All right, how do I use the magical ability to do this? And then it works. So I really enjoyed the puzzle difficulty. However, I do, in general, think that puzzles can be quite subjective. So what might seem straightforward and logical to one person might not for another. And for me, yeah, there are a lot of puzzles that I get to in games where I have no idea what I'm supposed to do. And then other people might say that these are easy or really well designed. And we were having a discussion in the Gaming in the Wild podcast Discord. Yeah, it seems that not everyone really feels the same. Some people, at the very start of the game, there is like a minecart puzzle, which has you kind of like, you have to move some minecarts around and go into different rooms and turn like a turntable so the tracks go in a different direction. And that one at the start did frustrate me a little bit, where I was kind of like, I'm not really sure what to do. But again, then once I worked it out, I was like, okay, I get this. This is really cool now. But a few of the guys in the Discord, kind of were a bit like, this is a bit too convoluted for me, which is, like I said, I think puzzles are very subjective to people. So and then the combat. So combat is based around having a light attack on, I think it's X, a heavy attack on Y, a roll on B, and then you have your 2 magical abilities on RB and LB. And in combat, magic costs mana, which can be restored by using heavy attacks on enemies, or you have potions as well, which can restore mana and obviously health. What I like is that the game, there is a character in the game who we'll talk about a bit more later called Hannah. And if you kind of get to the first level of friendship with her, again, we'll discuss this a bit more later, but you get to the first friendship with her, she gives you these abilities called attack conduits, which are sort of like special attacks that do a lot of damage to enemies. And you can use those by holding down, I think it's RT, and then you press one of the face buttons. If you get her to a certain, or if there's someone you have to get to a certain level, and then you unlock the 3rd attack conduit. I think you start with 2, but I did that, so it meant I had 3. And it's really cool because there are a lot of different ones in the game where you can kind of mix and match with them. And I like that the game actually has an achievement where it says if you use 7 different ones, you get the achievement. So that kind of motivated me to try out different ones. But in the end, I ended up settling on one where you kind of jump in and do like a ground pound that knocks enemies over. There was one where you kind of hold up your sword and it shoots out like butterfly rays at people, and they kind of explode when they hit them, which was really cool. And the 3rd one is one where you dive underground, and as you're moving underground, like rocks appear like where you are. Like, I don't know if you've seen Dune, it's a bit like the sand where the sandworm is as it's coming up. It's kind of a bit like that, but with rocks. And then if they hit enemies, it does damage to them. And I really like these because I think it kind of changed up the combat a little bit. And the other thing you can do is if you hold down LT and use one of the face buttons, you can also you can have 3 different potions equipped at any time, so you can use those. And I think actually, like, as much as I love the story, as much as I love the puzzles in the game, I think the combat was only just like okay for me. I think it was very like serviceable. and it did have some depth to it with the attack conduits. There are also charms that you can get and equip to yourself, which give you like higher attack or better defense, or there was one that's like a backstab ability where if you're attacking enemies from behind, it does more damage. So it does give you some kind of customization to how you want to attack. But yeah, the actual combat and like the moment-to-moment gameplay was only fine. Like it never quite felt as tight as it should have been. It was almost kind of like Louise's animations took a millisecond or two too long to animate, which made you kind of take damage, or maybe you should have dodged an attack when you'd press B to roll. Then there would just be like a little bit of a pause, and then she would roll, and in that pause you would take damage. So yeah, it never quite felt as kind of twitchy and yeah, as tight as I thought it was going to. But yeah, it was by no means bad. But it just felt okay to me. The game though, I think that it just has some really cool enemies. I think it was like a really great creative decision to have them kind of take the form of like alpines or Germanic folklore monsters, such as there's one called a Percht, which is like a large horned monster with a tree trunk club, and little ones called kobolds, which are sort of like a German goblin, which was cool. So I was like, yeah, I felt very inspired, made it kind of fit to the game and fit to the area, which I thought was great. And furthermore, at the end of each area in the game, there's also like a boss battle where you fight off with like a big bad in an arena, and also the boss battles. They feel very Zelda-like in the fact that there was kind of a puzzle to the battle, which you had to work out. And once you worked out the puzzle, you could then do damage and eventually defeat the boss. And by far my favourite was the Basilisk, which you beat at the end of Kolmstein. And yeah, it's awesome because you're kind of grinding on rails and having to shoot targets as you're moving on the Basilisk. So yeah, it felt very, very cool. And yeah, even though like the enemies and in the game were cool and felt quite varied, I think the toughest enemy of all in the game is actually the game's camera in combat, because it just always felt like the camera got in my way, and it wasn't quite fast enough to keep up with you, which is kind of like especially annoying when you're fighting against ranged enemies, because like I said, it's a third-person camera behind you. And the camera doesn't kind of stick to your back; it just sticks looking at you. So if you turn around and face the camera, you can't really see anything that's going to like in front of you anymore. So then you have to move the camera around. And yeah, it was very annoying with projectiles because you couldn't see. There was a lot of enemies that shoot projectiles, and you just couldn't see them at all, because if they were off screen, they were just firing at you, and it was very hard to tell what direction they were coming at. And I think maybe the devs realized this because they did add big red exclamation marks on the side of the screen when a projectile was coming. But yeah, I always just felt like, yeah, it was always a little bit too late, and I would try to dodge out of the way and then still get hit, so it was a little bit frustrating. And you can lock onto enemies by pressing R3. However, I think it didn't work that well if there were multiple enemies, because again, you would lock onto one and there might be multiple behind you still, which could be attacking you and you wouldn't know if they are. So yeah, the camera was a little bit of a challenge in the combat, and also because I didn't like the combat that much, it kind of made it feel a little bit like, oh, I wish this was a little bit better. And finally, just as like a little bit of kind of a wish, I guess, and not something that's like a criticism, but it would have been cool, because there is armor and weapons that you can find in the game to help Louisa level up her attack and her defense. I think that's basically what those two stats are based off of, is what weapons she has and what armor she has. And it always felt great finding new armor and swords, because you can't. I think it's very well paced that you find them so that you're leveling up quite consistently. And especially later on in the game, because again, if you make friends with Hannah, you can upgrade your sword and give it kind of they're not called charms, I can't remember what they're called, but kind of like gems that you can put in them. And I think I had one that gave me more critical hits, and there's one that gives me more physical attack, things like that. So again, you can kind of customize your sword damage, and also then your armor. You can there's I think 3 or 4 levels that you can upgrade them, which was cool. However, the one thing I didn't like about the armor and the weapons was they are not usually, but they could be sometimes locked behind one of Louisa's social stats, which meant that, like, okay, you would find like a new sword, but you couldn't use it until there was like a relaxation stat. It was like, oh, your relaxation has to be above this number for you to use it. So you couldn't use the swords whenever you found them, which was a little bit frustrating. And I think, yeah, in my kind of perfect world for this game, I would have really loved if the armor actually changed Louisa's appearance when you equipped it, or changed her outfit, because that's just like a feature of games that I love, or a feature of like RPGs or action games that you get a new suit of armor or a new item and it actually changes how your character looks. I know that might not be the scope for this kind of, we talked at the front, I did this smaller indie game by a relatively small team, but that would have been like a nice to have. But so that was the first half of Dungeons of Hinterberg. Like I said, it's split up into 2 parts. And before we move on to the second half, I again would just like to remind you that if you're enjoying the podcast, please leave us a 5-star review on Spotify or wherever you're listening. And now let's get on to the rest of the show. And the second half, is about making friends. So the game takes place on daily cycles that are broken up into morning, where you usually have breakfast and get some kind of dialogue about what's happening in the world from the owner of the guest house. I think she's called Teresa. Then you have the afternoon, which is usually where you go out and take on a dungeon, or you can go and relax somewhere. And then you have the evening where you head out into the village and either mingle with the locals, or kind of spend some time on your own if you're a bit more of like a loner. And then you have the night where you go to sleep. So therefore in the evening, it's your chance to go out and make new friends. And it's kind of like a cool twist on this Zelda dungeon crawling genre, because your friendships help unlock new mechanics for Louisa and upgrade her 4 social stats, which we talked about before, with the armor, which can then also help you progress further into the dungeons, because you get better armor if you have certain stats higher. So in total, there are 16 characters that you can befriend in the game, and each has between 2 and 4 levels of rewards for befriending them. The first and only friend that is kind of leveled up via the main quest is Alex. She's a more experienced slayer who convinces Louisa to keep on her slaying journey when she starts to question if she's made out for it or not. Otherwise, it's more or less up to you who you want to befriend and what upgrades you want for Louisa. And there's like a log that shows all of the characters in the game and shows you what you will get on the next level if you upgrade them. I'm not going to go through all of the people in the game, because I also don't want to spoil it. But some of my favorites were Travis, who I think is the first person you meet. He's like a hipster journalist stuck reporting on Hinterberg against his will. I really liked him because he unlocked a photo mode in the game, and the photo mode was great because this game is a stunning game. I took loads of screenshots. If you go to my Ko-fi Ko-fi site, the link will be in the description. You can see all of the screenshots there because I took a lot of them. Then you have Klaus, who is a local celebrity who becomes a disgruntled guide to the magical dungeons of Hinterberg. Marina, a Spanish tourist working summer jobs to pay for her stay in Hinterberg. I especially liked her because I think if you get her up to level 2, she unlocks breakfast for you in your guest house or in like your hotel, which gives you a little extra perk every day, so you can get more health or better mana recovery or faster attack conduit recovery, which is cool. And finally, Gertrude, like I actually didn't like her really as a person. She's kind of like a snobby Viennese, kind of not aristocrat, but kind of aristocrat. But it's kind of cool because she kind of plays the tourist of, she has always holidayed in Hinterberg for a long time, for years and years and years. And she knew the village before it became famous. And she has like an interesting story about that, how it used to be. And I think we'll get on to a bit about like it being Austrian, but I think that's something that I think a lot of people can maybe relate to in Austria, because I feel like my wife's family, they always go to the same like kind of holiday farm every year, or they did when my wife was a kid. And now that we have a daughter and we have a niece, we've been going back there, and it's also the same there, that they've been going there for 30 years and go nearly every year, and they're always kind of talking about how it's changed. And I thought that was quite interesting with Gertrude too. But in general, I liked all of the characters in the game because they did all feel very kind of fleshed out and all had really like interesting reasons why they were in Hinterberg. It wasn't just kind of like, here is someone to talk to. It's kind of like, here is this person that is in Hinterberg for their own reasons and has their own perspective on what's happening in Hinterberg, which I thought was quite interesting because it gave a bit more lore and depth to Hinterberg itself. I liked them so much so that it does feel a bit stressful in the game, because I did want to befriend all of them and unlock all of their perks. But the game does put like quite a lot of pressure on you to finish it after you've... So like I said, there's 25 dungeons, and when you get to your 24th dungeon, every day in the game is like, oh, I really need to finish. I need to get this last one done. Like the world is falling apart. We need to finish. And you kind of a bit like... it's a bit like it becomes like a bit clumsy to then befriend them all, because what happens is during the afternoon you still have this loop of morning, afternoon and evening, but you obviously need to get to evening to befriend these people. So in the afternoon there's only one dungeon left, and the way the story kind of goes and the way the game tells you that this is the final dungeon and you need to finish it quickly. So the only way you can skip the afternoon is going to relaxation spots, and then in the evening then talking to people to get their level up to finish them, which again, yeah, it feels very clumsy because you're then just skipping the afternoon and just skipping through the days as quickly as possible, and every day the game is telling you need to finish. So I think in my opinion, I think what you're actually supposed to do is, in your first playthrough, is to become friends with the people that you actually like. I don't think it's meant to be that you are supposed to befriend everyone in one playthrough. And I think the devs really want you to actually replay the game and get more friendships with other people. So like, yeah, maybe on your first playthrough, you make friends with the people that you actually resonate with. And then on your second playthrough, you then go and make friends with all of the other people that you didn't really get to spend enough time with in the first playthrough. And I think this is kind of shown in the achievements for the game, because there isn't an actual achievement for like completely befriending every single character. There's an achievement for meeting every single character, which you can do easily, but not one for absolutely like maxing out their friendship level. So yeah, I would suggest if you're thinking about playing the game, or you've just started playing the game, that you should just make friends with the people that you like, and then if you feel compelled enough that you enjoyed the game, then maybe do a second playthrough, and then try and focus on the people that you didn't have time to make friends with in the first playthrough to really fill out their friendship levels. And I think this mix up of Persona relationships and Zelda dungeons is kind of genius. Thinking about it, I'm kind of like, this is kind of what Zelda Persona is actually. But there isn't necessarily this puzzle aspect to a lot of the dungeons in Persona. So I think it's more like I would argue that this game is actually more like Persona than Zelda. I think the only Zelda influence is the dungeon design and some of the bosses, whereas everything else is more or less just Persona. But I think, yeah, both kind of sides of these two games really feed well into one another in Dungeons of Hinterberg. And the thing of like, yeah, that you level up Louisa by leveling up social stats, what you do outside of the dungeon, is a really, really cool loop. So yeah, very, very cool game. And it's not just a cool game, it's also an absolutely stunning game. And as you probably heard me say in other podcasts and reviews, the art of the game is usually the thing that brings me into a game when I first see it. And this was definitely the case with Dungeons of Hinterberg. I think the first time I saw it, there was some Xbox, like Idea Xbox show or some developer show at Xbox. And the art brought me in then, and then also the hook of it being a game made in Vienna then kind of had me on the hook ever since. And I've kind of been following the game quite not religiously, but quite consistently since its release. And yeah, it's a stunning game, and like I said, I think you can tell how stunning I found it because of how many photos I took. I took so many screenshots of the game, and not just like just a screenshot of something happening. I got tried to get very arty with it and do different angles. And yeah, if you're interested in seeing the screenshots, like I said, I'll put a link to my Ko-fi in the bio, and you can look at them there. And yeah, I also like the art style of the game. It reminds me of a more bright and cheerful Sable, if you know that game, because it has the same kind of Mobius inspiration behind it, with like very thin outlines and really otherworldly kind of blocked colouring, which feels especially cool in this game because the game is based in the real world, but it has this very bright and, like I said, very like Mobius alien feeling colours all over. So it's a really, really stunning game. If you haven't seen it before, definitely look up some screenshots or look up some gameplay, because it's a gorgeous game. And finally, what I really liked about this game is that it is authentically Austrian. So a lot of people who don't live in Austria or aren't Austrian might have missed a lot of the Easter eggs, but there are a lot of very Austrian themed Easter eggs in the game. For example, if you go to the vending machine and you buy a health snack, there is a little icon, and on the icon is it's called a Leberkäse-Semmel. So it's like a liver sandwich, I guess a liver cheese sandwich, I guess would be the translation. Like Leberkäse is like the meat in it, and Semmel is the bread on top. And this is like a very popular and very unhealthy fast food sandwich that you find in Austria. It's kind of something that, like, yeah, I personally don't eat that often, but if I did eat it, it would probably after like a drunken night out, like waiting for the train to go home or something like that. I would eat it then. And the other icon for the MP snack is something called a Mannerschnitter, which is like a very famous Austrian kind of, I guess you would call it like biscuit. It's kind of like wafer with bits of like nut, like nougat in the middle of it. And yeah, it's like this is kind of like this, along with something else called Mozartskugeln, which are like, the translation would be Mozart's balls. Like the traditional gift that you take to people as like, oh, this is the most Austrian thing you can give as a gift to someone, like who is like, so if I go back to go back to England and visit my family, I'll bring them like Mannerschnitten because it's so Austrian. And in addition, Hinterberg itself, it looks just like a small kind of touristy Austrian town with the Gasthäuser, which are the kind of the guest house where you sleep, in bright colours with flowers on their balconies. Again, that's very Austrian, like Swiss kind of theme of they have these really bright flowers on their balconies. Even like the owner of the guest house coming and making small talk in the morning whilst you have breakfast feels very authentic to me. Like I was saying before, like some of the places where my wife's family went when my wife was growing up, you have this exact experience. You sit down for breakfast, the owner of the establishment comes over, it's usually an older person, makes some kind of small talk about the game, and then it usually ends with them asking how you want your eggs, because you always get eggs kind of freshly made for you, so you can ask, you can tell them what you want, it scrambled, you want it fried, however you want it boiled. That's usually how this conversation starts every morning when you're in Austria on holiday, so that also felt very authentic. Again, the village itself also being on kind of like a hill with a small stream running down the streets screams of Hallstatt to me, because Hallstatt also has a stream running through it. And then it's kind of like a joke between me and my wife, but every Austrian village has like a big yellow bank in it, and the bank is called Raiffeisen. I think it's a German bank, but it's like every village in Austria has this big yellow building with the Raiffeisen bank. And the Hinterberg has it as well, right next to the church. So that was also kind of like a yeah. Even video game Austrian villages have a big yellow Raiffeisen bank. And then it's not just that, but there's also like some of the things Louisa talks about that also just remind me of Austria a lot, or Austrian people. If you go to one of the relaxation points on Kollenstein, which is the winter, like the peak of the mountain where there's a lot of snow, Louisa reminisces about her childhood skiing trips, and talking about that they would get woken up at like 6:30 in the morning so they could get on the slopes as early as possible, and could just before a lot of the other tourists get there, and then can just enjoy the slopes and spend all day skiing. And yeah, I mean, so of course this game had to have some kind of winter sport in it. I'm quite surprised that they went with snowboarding though, and not like having magical skis. But yeah, just how Louisa talked about her holidays, her childhood holidays, is again very similar to how I feel like my wife and her family talk about their childhood skiing holidays. And again, it just feels just very authentic to me. And finally, yeah, I love the dungeons. So how you have to end the dungeon is there is like a stamp at the end that then unlocks a portal back to the real world, and you have like a stamp book which you then have to stamp to say that you did the dungeon. And again, it's just very very like reminiscent of like the hiking culture in Austria, of how there will be different huts along the hiking trail, or different points along the hiking trail where there will be a stamp that you can put in your stamp book to say, okay, I reached station 1 or I reached station 2, and as you trek up the mountain. And then again, another joke that me and my wife have is that like if there is a peak of a mountain in Austria, then the Austrians have to build a cross on top of it. And in the two peaks in this game, in Doberkugel and in Kollenstein, there is a big massive cross on top of it. Very Austrian, very much like a kind of like a tongue-in-cheek joke that like I say, we have between me and my wife. So obviously living in Austria, I might be a bit biased towards the game. However, I do think it's really cool that Microbird decided to base the game in Austria, because I think for like marketing purposes, it would have made the game way more marketable to a wider audience if it was like, oh, these dungeons had appeared in London, or they'd appeared in San Francisco or New York. And there is kind of little nods in the game that there is other places in the world where these dungeons are appearing. So they say that it's happening in Venice, in Hastings, which I think is a very random, two random places. So I don't know if there are people from the Microbird team that are from those places. Maybe that's why. But yeah, I think it's cool that they decided to base it in Austria, in a small town. And like I said at the start of the episode, I think there are a lot of small towns, not just in Austria, but in the rest of Europe, that have, I guess, since COVID, had these massive booms in tourism, and they're kind of having to deal with what do we do about it? Like how much do we want to ride this gravy train of all of these people coming here? Because at the start it's great, especially after COVID, if a lot of these hotels and restaurants had been struggling, a lot of people have come back, and a lot of these proprietors of these places are making a lot of money. But then what happens in the long run when this happens for years and years and years, and like I said, maybe these places lose a bit of their charm and a bit of their character and a bit of their soul, because all of the locals can't afford to live there anymore, or because a lot of drunk British people go there on holiday every year, So yeah, it's quite an interesting question. And speaking of questions, we actually do have some questions. So again, I asked in the Gaming in the Wild Discord if anyone had any questions in the game, because the guys there, a lot of them are playing the game. And I'll put a link to John's Discord, not to his Discord, sorry, to his Patreon and to his podcast in the description, because it's a fantastic podcast and also a great community. And you can get access to the Discord via John's Patreon. So yeah, I'll link all that down there if you're interested in joining, because it's a great podcast and a great Discord. So from their Discord, from John's Discord, Dovetail has a couple of questions, and Dovetail's first one that he asked is, did the story and writing resonate with you, and why or why not it didn't? And yeah, I think maybe I've kind of covered these questions already in the podcast, but just to be specific, I think it did, because I do have this Austrian connection, and like I said, I think the story becomes less about there is magic in this town, and it becomes more about, well, how does the town react to this, and which direction does the town want to go? Does it want to go into the more capitalist, profit based, we are now going to become a global destination, or does it become a kind of like, okay, no, this isn't what our town is about, and this isn't really what the locals of the town want? And that's kind of the conflict within the game. So that's kind of, I think the writing was really, really good. The second question comes, do you feel the game benefited from the mashup of Persona and Zelda elements, or should it be more focused on one or the other? And kind of like I said, I personally think it is more Persona focused, because Persona also has a lot of this. It has a dungeon crawling aspect, but it's more turn-based, kind of like dungeon crawling. Yeah, there isn't necessarily so many puzzles. And you have the aspect there of like the friendship. The stronger your friendship bonds become, the stronger your party becomes in the dungeon. It also reminds me a lot of actually Fire Emblem too. Fire Emblem does this as well, where outside of the battles, like Fire Emblem Three Houses, you are based in a school, and you can also kind of pick and choose who you want to talk to level them up, to get stronger relationships, so that when you are battling with them, it makes the battles easier. So I think you could also argue that it is also a bit of Fire Emblem mashed up in there. But I think the game is more leaning towards that side than the Zelda, because I think the Zelda, like Dovetail says, the Zelda elements are that the dungeons then are puzzle-based dungeons, and there is like a lot of combat, like more modernized combat, I guess, of Zelda. So yeah, I think it does benefit from it. I think it is a really good loop. Like, I like this, that you feel like you are sort of upgrading your character outside of the dungeons. I think that's a really cool loop. I think, like I said, where the game kind of maybe frustrates the player is that the game, you get this feeling that you can make friends with everyone, whereas I think actually you can't, because unless you play the game really, really, really slowly, you can't really do it without being stressed out at the end of the game telling you, okay, you need to finish now. So yeah, so I think it is a good mashup. Yeah. And the final question is, how did your history living in Vienna add to your experience? And we've kind of talked about that a little bit as well, about how authentic the game is to Austria. And yeah, I think it's also mostly the reason why I played this game. Like I said, I love the art style, but Austria as a country of like making video games, it has a lot of small indie game developers, but a lot of them might not necessarily get to make it onto the main stage. Like, I think obviously there is THQ Nordic is based in Vienna, but that's more of a publisher. I don't think they necessarily develop games here. Moon Studios is an Austrian indie game studio, and they're famous for the Ori games and from is it No Rest for the Wicked, which recently came out. But I don't think they're necessarily based here. I think they're all remote. And then now Microbird has Dungeons of Hinterberg, and there are lots of smaller studios or just indie devs that work on games. But I don't think a lot of them actually get to release their games and have it really be on such a wide global stage. So I think this is really cool that Microbird managed to do this, that they partnered with Curve Games to publish it, and then also partnered with Xbox to get the game out on Xbox and on Xbox Game Pass, which again gives it this massive boost. And yeah, I'm just really happy that it seems to have gone well for them, because like I said, there are a lot of really glowing reviews out there from a lot of big sites, which is usually a good sign that people are playing the game. And like I said too, it's out on Game Pass, and I think that's why a lot of people in the Gaming in the Wild Discord played it, because it was on Game Pass. They were like, yeah, why not try it out? And I think a few guys really liked it and really loved the game and played it through to the end, and a few others kind of were like, yeah, it's not for me, but it's kind of nice that they got to try it. So as kind of someone that lives in Vienna and has lived here for 8 years, I think now, I moved in 2016. It's nice to kind of see that, because I myself work in kind of the game development sphere, but I work in the gambling kind of industry and develop gambling games. And I think that's what Austria is kind of known for, is a lot of like gambling games and slot games, and being like a kind of a core place, because this is where Novomatic is based. It's an Austrian company. So I think it's nice that maybe that is kind of shifting to being like, okay, some of these indie studios are becoming kind of well-known names within the gaming industry, and hopefully that means for Austria that it becomes a bit better known as like a place where a lot of really cool video games are made. So yeah, so that's that kind of added to the experience, as well as the things that I said about it being authentically Austrian. So yeah, Dovetail, thank you so much for your questions. And I guess the final question that you might have about Dungeons of Hinterberg is, should you play it? And so Dungeons of Hinterberg is one of my favourite games of 2024. Its mashup of Zelda-like dungeons and Persona-like relationship management feels completely unique and comes together in a complete package. The story of the game at first feels like a throwaway fantasy story about monsters and magic, but quickly turns into a question about how mass tourism affects the communities and the wildlife of villages and towns that it occurs in, and if profits are worth more than the souls of those communities. The dungeons and puzzles in the game were exceptionally well designed. I always looked forward to entering them and felt the difficulty was a Goldilocks just right for me. They were challenging and felt rewarding when completing them, and the game looks gorgeous and runs exceptionally well, which felt so good after playing the bug-riddled Pokemon Scarlet before this game. The one thing that lets the game down for me is the combat. It never felt as tight and twitchy as I would have liked, and the camera could be a worse opponent at times. So yeah, if you have Xbox Game Pass, please give Dungeons of Hinterberg a try. I actually decided last month that I was going to cancel my subscription to Game Pass, so I ended up buying the game for the asking price of $29.99. That was in euros. For me, it's completely worth the price and completely worth trying out. Especially I know obviously because I'm based in Austria, I have a lot of Austrian listeners. If you are an Austrian listener, you should definitely try the game, because it supports a local Viennese studio. It's very authentically Austrian, and if you have an Xbox and you already have Game Pass, then why not try it out, because you're more or less getting it in quotation marks for free. So yeah guys, that was episode 39 of the Beat Your Backlog podcast. If you have played the game, I know a lot of the guys in the Gaming in the Wild server have, please let me know. Or is it maybe on your list to play now that you've listened to the podcast? And you can let me know if you're a Spotify listener by commenting down in the comments below. So on Spotify, you can comment now. So you can, kind of like a YouTube video, you can just comment there with your thoughts. And if you're listening elsewhere, you can let me know on social media by @ing me on Twitter @SwitchIndieFix, or on you can comment on one of my posts on Instagram @BYB_podcast. Or if you do use Discord, we do now have a Discord server. I revived the old Switch Indie Fix server. Trying to revive the old Switch Indie Fix server. So you can join the Discord there. Again, the link will be in the description. And yeah, if you're in the mood to listen to more content about an absolute magical indie game gem that came out this year, make sure you check out episode 33 of the podcast about Harold Halibut. And yeah, to remind you all guys, Beat Your Backlog is the newest podcast that needs your support. So if you enjoyed the episode, please consider subscribing and or following wherever you're listening, and leaving us a 5-star review. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time. Bye bye.